Chapter 13 Off the Map. Across the lock of the panel was the seal set in place by Van Ryck before the spacer had lifted from Sargol. Under Dane's inspection it showed no crack. To all evidence, the hatch had not been opened since they left the perfumed planet. And yet the hunting Hubbat was sure that the invading pests were within. It took only a second for Dane to commit an act which, if he could not defend it later, would blacklist him out of space. He twisted off the official seal, which should remain there while the freighter was spaceborne. With Ollie's help, he shouldered aside the heavy sliding panel, and they looked into the cargo space, now filled with the red wood from Sargol. The redwood. When he saw it, Dane was struck with their stupidity. Aside from the Koro stones in the stone box, only the wood had come from the Salariki world. What if the pest had not been planted by IS agents, but were natives of Sargol being brought in with the wood? The men remained at the hatch to allow the Hubbat freedom in its hunt, and Sinbad crouched behind them, snarling and giving voice to a rumbling growl which was his negative opinion of the proceedings. They were conscious of an odor, the sharp, unidentifiable scent Dane had noticed during the loading of the wood. It was not unpleasant, merely different. And it, or something, had an electrifying effect upon Queeks. The blue hunter climbed with the aid of its claws to the top of the nearest pile of wood, and there settled down. For a space it was apparently contemplating the area about it. Then it raised its claws and began the scraping fiddle, which once before had drawn its prey out of hiding. Oddly enough, that dry rasp of sound had a quieting effect upon Sinbad, and Dane felt the drag of the harness lessen as the cat moved, not toward escape, but to the scene of action, humping himself at last in the open panel, his round eyes fixed upon the Hubbat with a fascinated stare. Scrape, scrape. The monotonous sound bit into the ears of the men, gnawed at their nerves. "Ah!" Ollie kept his voice to a whisper, but his hand jerked to draw their attention to the right at deck level. Dane saw that flicker along a log. The stowaway pest was now the same brilliant color as the wood, indistinguishable until it moved, which probably explained how it had come on board. But that was only the first arrival. A second flash of movement, and a third followed. Then the hunted remained stationary, able to resist for a period the insidious summoning of Queeks. The Hubbat maintained an attitude of indifference, of being so wrapped in its music that nothing else existed. Rip whispered to Weeks, "There's one to the left, on the very end of that log. Can you net it?" The small oiler slipped the coiled mesh through his calloused hands. He edged around Ollie, keeping his eyes on the protruding bump of red upon red which was his quarry. 2, 3, 4, 5. Ollie was counting under his breath, but Dane could not see that many. He was sure of only 4, and those because he had seen them move. The things were ringing in the pile of wood where the Hubbat fiddled, and 2 had ascended the first logs toward their doom. Weeks went down on one knee, ready to cast his net, when Dane had his first inspiration. He drew his sleep rod, easing it out of its holster, set the lever on spray, and beamed it at 3 of those humps. Rip, seeing what he was doing, dropped a hand on Weeks's shoulder, holding the oiler in check. A hump moved, slid down the rounded side of the log into the narrow aisle of deck between 2 piles of wood. It lay quiet, a bright scarlet blot against the gray. Then Weeks did move, throwing his net over it and jerking the drawstring tight, at the same time pulling the captive toward him over the deck. But even as it came, the scarlet of the thing's body was fast fading to an ashy pink, and at last taking on a gray as dull as the metal on which it lay, the complete camouflage. Had they not had it enmeshed, they might have lost it altogether, so well did it now blend with the surface. The other two in the path of the ray had not lost their grip upon the logs, and the men could not advance to scoop them up. Not while there were others not affected, free to flee back into hiding. Weeks bound the net about the captive and looked to Rip for orders. "Deep freeze," the acting commander of the Queen said succinctly. "Let me see it get out of that." Surely the cold of the deep freeze, united to the sleep ray, would keep the creature under control until they had a chance to study it. But, as Weeks passed Sinbad on his errand, the cat was so frantic to avoid him that he reared up on his hind legs, almost turning a somersault, snarling and spitting until Weeks was up the ladder to the next level. It was very evident that the ship's cat was having none of this pest. They might have been invisible and their actions non-existent as far as Queeks was concerned, for the Hoobat continued its siren concert. The Lurd became more reckless, mounting the logs to Queeks's post in sudden darts. Dane wondered how the Hoobat proposed handling 4 of the creatures at once. 4, although the other 2 which had been in the path of the ray had not moved, he now counted 4 climbing. "Stand by to ray," that was Rip. But it would have been interesting to see how Queeks was prepared to handle the 4. And though Rip had given the order to stand by, he had not ordered the ray to be used. Was he, too, interested in that? The first red projection was within a foot of the Hoobat now, and its fellows had frozen, as if to allow it the honor of battle with the feathered enemy. To all appearances, Queeks did not see it, but when it sprang with a whir of speed which would baffle a human, the Hoobat was ready, and its claws, halting their rasp, met around the wasp-thin waist of the pest, speedily cutting it in 2. Only this time the Hoobat made no move to unjoint and consume the victim. Instead, it squatted in utter silence, as motionless as a 3D print. The heavy lower half of the creature rolled down the pile of logs to the deck, and there paled to the gray of its background. None of its kind appeared to be interested in its fate. The 2 which had been in the path of the ray continued to be humps on the wood. The others faced the Hoobat. But Rip was ready to waste no more time. "Ray them," he snapped. All 3 of their sleep rods sprayed the pile, catching in passing the Hoobat. Queeks's pop eyes closed, but it showed no other sign of falling under the spell of the beam. Certain that all the creatures in sight were now relatively harmless, the 3 approached the logs. But it was necessary to get into touching distance before they could even make out the outlines of the nightmare things, so well did their protective coloring conceal them. Wearing gloves, Ollie detached the little monsters from their holds on the wood and put them for temporary safekeeping, during a transfer to the deep freeze, into the Hoobat's cage. Queeks they decided to leave where it was for a space, to awaken and trap any survivor which had been too wary to emerge at the first siren song. As far as they could tell, the Hoobat was their only possible protection against the pest, and to leave it in the center of infection was the wisest course. Having dumped the now metal-colored catch into the freeze, they held a conference. "No plague," Weeks breathed a sigh of relief. "No proof of that yet," Ollie caught him up short. "We have to prove it past any reasonable doubt." "And how are we going to do?" Dane began when he saw what the other had brought in from Tao's stores. A lancet and the upper half of the creature Queeks had killed in the cargo hold. The needle-pointed front feet of the thing were curled up in its death throes, and it was now a dirty white shade, as if the ability to change color had been lost before it matched the cotton on which it lay. With the lancet, Ollie forced a claw away from the body. It was oozing the watery liquid which they had seen on the one in the hydro. "I have an idea," he said slowly, his eyes on the mangled creature rather than on his shipmates. that we might have escaped being attacked because they sheared off from us. But if we were clawed, we might take it too. Remember those marks on the throats and backs of the rest? That might be the entry point of this poison, if poison it is. Dane could see the end of that line of reasoning. Rip and Ollie, they couldn't be spared. The knowledge they had would bring the Queen to Earth. But a cargo master was excess baggage when there was no reason for trade. It was his place to try out the truth of Ollie's surmise. But while he thought, another acted. Weeks leaned over and twitched the lancet out of Ollie's fingers. Then, before any of them could move, he thrust its contaminated point into the back of his hand. "Don't!" Both Dane's cry and Rip's hand came too late. It had been done. And Weeks sat there, looking alone and frightened, studying the drop of blood which marked the dig of the surgeon's keen knife. But when he spoke, his voice sounded perfectly natural. "Headache first, isn't it?" Only Ollie was outwardly unaffected by what the little man had just done. "Just be sure you have a real one," he warned with what Dane privately considered real callousness. Weeks nodded. "Don't let my imagination work," he answered shrewdly. "I know. It has to be real. How long do you suppose?" "We don't know." Rip sounded tired, beaten. "Meanwhile," he got to his feet, "we'd better set a course home." "Home," Weeks repeated. To him, Terra was not his own home. He had been born in the polar swamps of Venus. But to all Solarians, no matter which planet had nurtured them, Terra was home. "You," Rip's big hand fell gently on the little oiler's shoulder, "stay here with Thorson." "No," Weeks shook his head. "Unless I black out, I'm riding station in the engine room. Maybe the bug won't work on me anyway." And because he had done what he had done, they could not deny him the right to ride his station as long as he could during the grueling hours to come. Dane visited the cargo hold once more, to be greeted by an irate scream which assured him that Queeks was again awake and on guard. Although the Hoobat was ready enough to give tongue, it still squatted in its chosen position on the top of the log stack, and he did not try to dislodge it. Perhaps with Queeks planted in the enemy's territory, they would have nothing to fear from any pest not now confined in the deep freeze. Rip set his course for Terra, for that plague spot on their native world where they might hide out the Queen until they could prove their point, that the Spacer was not a disease-ridden ship to be feared. He kept to the control cabin, shifting only between the astrogators and pilot station. Upon him alone rested the responsibility of bringing in the ship along a vector which crossed no well-traveled space lane, where the patrol might challenge them. Dane wrote out the orbiting in the Comtech seat, listening in for the first warning of danger, that they had been detected. The mechanical repetition of their list of crimes was now stale news and largely off ether. And from all traces he could pick up, they were lost as far as the authorities were concerned. On the other hand, the patrol might indeed be as far-knowing as its propaganda stated, and the Queen was running headlong into a trap. Only they had no choice in the matter. It was the ship's intercom bringing Ollie's voice from the engine room which broke the concentration in the control cabin. "Weeks down." Rip barked into the mic. "How bad?" "He hasn't blacked out yet. The pains in his head are pretty bad, and his hand is swelling." "He's given us our proof. Tell him to report off." But the disembodied voice which answered was Weeks. "I haven't got it as bad as the others. I'll ride this out." Rip shook his head, but short-handed as they were, he could not argue Weeks away from his post, if the man insisted upon staying. He had other, and for the time being, more important matters before him. How long they sweated out that descent upon their native world, Dane could never afterwards have testified. He only knew that hours must have passed until he thought groggily that he could not remember a time he was not glued in the seat which had been Tang's, the earphones pressing against his sweating skull, his fatigue-drugged mind being held with difficulty to the duty at hand. Sometime during that haze they made their landing. He had a dim memory of Rip sprawled across the pilot's control board, and then utter exhaustion claimed him also, and the darkness closed in. When he roused, it was to look about the cabin tilted to one side. Rip was still slumped in a muscle-cramping posture, breathing heavily. Dane bit out a forceful word born of twinges of his own, and then snapped on the visa-plate. For a long moment he was sure that he was not yet awake, and then, as his dazed mind supplied names for what he saw, he knew that Rip had failed. Far from being in the center, or at least well within the perimeter of the dreaded Big Burn, he must have landed in some civic park or national forest. For the massed green outside, the bright flowers, the bird he cited as a brilliant flash of wind-coasting color, those were not to be found in the twisted horror left by man's last attempt to impress his will upon his resisting kind. Well, it had been a good try, but there was no use expecting luck to ride their fins all the way, and they had had more than their share in the Eastat affair. How long would it be before the law arrived to collect them? Would they have time to state their case? The faint hope that they might aroused him. He reached for the comm key, and a second later tore the headphones from his appalled ears. The crackle of static he knew, and the numerous strange noises which broke in upon the lanes of communication in space. But this solid, paralyzing roar was something totally new and frightening. And because it was new, and he could not account for it, he turned back to regard the scene and the viewer with a more critical eye. The foliage which grew in riotous profusion was green right enough, and terra green into the bargain. There was no mistaking that. But Dane caught at the edge of the comm unit for support. But what was that liver-red blossom which had just reached out to engulf a small flying thing? Feverishly, he tried to remember the little natural history he knew. Sure that what he had just witnessed was unnatural, un-Terran, and to be suspect. He started the spy lens on its slow revolution in the Queen's nose to get a full picture of their immediate surroundings. It was tilted at an angle. Apparently they had not made a fin-point landing this time, and sometimes it merely reflected slices of sky. But when it swept earthward, he saw enough to make him believe that wherever the spacer had set down, it was not on the Terra he knew. Subconsciously, he had expected the Big Burn to be barren land, curdled rock with rivers of frozen quartz, substances boiled up through the crust of the planet by the action of the atomic explosives. That was the way it had been on Limbo, on the other burned-off worlds they had discovered, where those who had preceded mankind into the galaxy, the mysterious, long-vanished Forerunners, had fought their grim and totally annihilating wars. But it would seem that the Big Burn was altogether different. At least here it was. There was no rock sterile of life outside. In fact, there would appear to be too much life. What Dane could sight in his limited field of vision was a teeming jungle. And the thrill of that discovery almost made him forget their present circumstances. He was still staring bemused at the screen when Rip muttered, turned his head on his folded arms, and opened his sunken eyes. "Did we make it?" he asked dully. Dane, not taking his eyes from that fascinating scene without, answered, "You brought us down, but I don't know where. Unless our instruments were way off, we're near to the heart of the burn." "Some heart." "What does it look like?" Rip sounded too tired to cross the cabin and see for himself. "Barren as Limbo?" "Hardly. Rip, did you ever see a tomato as big as a melon? At least it looks like a tomato." Dane halted the spy lens as it focused upon this new phenomena. "A what?" There was a note of concern in Shannon's voice. "What's the matter with you, Dane? Come and see." Dane willingly yielded his place to Rip, but he did not step out of range of the screen. Surely that did have the likeness to a good, old-fashioned earth-side tomato, but it was melon-size, and it hung from a bush which was close to a 10-foot tree. Rip stumbled across to drop into the Comtex place, but his expression of worry changed to one of simple astonishment as he saw that picture. "Where are we?" "You name it." Dane had had longer to adjust, the excitement of an explorer sighting virgin territory working in his veins, banishing fatigue. "It must be the Big Burn." "But—" Rip shook his head slowly, as if with that gesture to deny the evidence before his eyes. "That country's all bare rock. I've seen pictures." "Of the outer rim," Dane corrected, having already solved that problem for himself. "This must be farther in than any survey ship ever came. Great spirit of outer space, what has happened here?" Rip had enough technical training to know how to get part of the answer. He leaned halfway across the comm and was able to flick down a lever with the very tip of his longest finger. Instantly the cabin was filled with a clicking so loud as to make an almost continuous drone of sound. Dane knew that danger signal. He didn't need Rip's words to underline it for him. "That's what's happened. This country is pile hot out there." End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14. Special Mission. That click, the dial beneath the counter, warned them that they were as cut off from the luxuriance outside as if they were viewing a scene on Mars or Sargol from their present position. To go beyond the shielding walls of the spacer into that riotous green world would sentence them to death as surely as if the patrol was without, with a flamer trained on their hatch. There was no escape from that radiation. It would be in the air one breathed, strike through one's skin. And yet the wilderness flourished and beckons. "Mutations," Rip mused. "Space, Tao'd go wild if he could see it." And that mention of the medic brought them back to the problem which had earthed them. Dane leaned back against the slanting wall of the cabin. "We have to have a medic." Rip nodded without looking away from the screen. "Can one of the flitters be shielded?" the cargo apprentice persisted. "That's a thought. Ollie should know." Rip reached for the intercom mic. "Engines." "So you are alive." Ollie's voice had a bite in it. "About time you're contacting. Where are we? Besides being lopsided from a recruit's scrambled set-down, I mean." "In the Big Burn. Come topside. Wait, how's Weeks?" "He has a devil's own headache, but he hasn't blacked out yet. Looks like his immunity holds in part. I've sent him bunkside for a while with a couple of pain pills, so we've made it." He must have left to join them, for when Rip answered, "After a fashion," into the mic, there was no reply. And the clang of his bootplates on the ladder heralded his arrival at their post. There was an interval for him to view the outer world and accept the verdict of the counter, and then Rip voiced Dane's question. "Can we shield one of the flitters well enough to cross that? I can't take the Queen up and earth her again." "I know you can't," the acting engineer cut in. "Maybe you could get her off-world, but you'll come close to blasting out when you try for another landing. Fuel doesn't go on forever, though some of you space jockeys seem to think it does. The flitter, well, we've some spare rocket linings, but it's going to be a job and a half to get those beaten out and reassembled. And, frankly, the space whirly one who flies her had better be suited and praying loudly when he takes off. We can always try." He was frowning, already busied with the problem which was one for his department. So, with intervals of snatched sleep, hurried meals, and the time which must be given to tending their unconscious charges, Rip and Dane became only hands to be directed by Ollie's brain and garnered knowledge. Weeks slept off the worst of his pain, and though he complained of weakness, he tottered back on duty to help. The flitter, an air sled intended to hold 3 men and supplies for exploring trips on strange worlds, was first stripped of all non-essentials until what remained was not much more than the pilot's seat and the motor. Then they labored to build up a shielding of the tough radiation-dulling alloy which was used to line rocket tubes. They could only praise the foresight of Stotts, who carried such a full supply of spare parts and tools. It was a task over which they often despaired, and Ollie improvised frantically, performing weird adjustments of engineering structure. He was still unsatisfied when they had done. "She'll fly," he admitted, "and she's the best we can do. But it'll depend a lot on how far she has to go over hot country. Which way do we head her?" Rip had been busy with a map of Terra, a small thing he had discovered in one of the travel recordings carried for crew entertainment. "The Big Burn covers 3/4 of this continent. There's no use going north. The devastated area extends into the Arctic regions. I'd say west. There's some fringe settlements on the seacoast, and we need to contact a frontier territory. Now, do we have it straight? I'd take the flitter, get a medic, and bring him back." Dane cut in at that point. "Correct course. You stay here. If the Queen has to lift, you're the only one who can take her off-world. And that's the same for Ollie. I can't ride out a blast-off in either the pilot's or the engineer's seat, and Weeks is on the sick list. So I'm elected to do the medic hunting." They were forced to agree to that. He was no hero, Dane thought, as he gave a last glance about his cabin early the next morning. The small cubby, utilitarian and bare as it was, never looked more inviting or secure. No hero. It was merely a matter of common sense. And although his imagination, that deeply hidden imagination with which few of his fellows credited him, shrank from the ordeal ahead, he had not the slightest intention of allowing that to deter him. The spacesuit, which had been bulky and clumsy enough on the Eastad asteroid under limited gravity, was almost twice as poorly adapted to progression on Earth. But he climbed into it with Rip's aid, while Ollie lashed a second suit under the seat, ready to encase the man Dane must bring back with him. Before he closed the helmet, Rip had one last order to give, along with an unexpected piece of equipment. And, when Dane saw that, he knew just how desperate Shannon considered their situation to be. For only on life-or-death terms would the astrogator apprentice have used Jellicoe's private key, opened the forbidden arms cabinet, and withdrawn that blaster. "If you need it, use this." Rip's face was very sober. Ollie arose from fastening the extra suit in place. "It's ready." He came back into the corridor, and Dane clanked out in his place, settling himself behind the controls. When they saw him there, the inner hatch closed, and he was alone in the bay. With tantalizing slowness, the outer wall of the spacer slid back. His hands blundering with the metallic claws of the gloves, Dane buckled 2 safety belts about him. Then the skeleton flitter moved to the left, out into the glare of the early day, a light too bright, even through the shielded viewplates of his helmet. For some dangerous moments, the machine creaked out and down on the landing cranes, the warning counter on its control panel going into a mad whirl of color as it tried to record the radiation. There came a jar as it touched the scorched earth at the foot of the Queen's fins. Dane pressed the release and watched the lines whip up and the hatch above snap shut. Then he opened the controls. He used too much energy and shot into the air, tearing a wide gap through what was luckily a thin screen of the matted foliage, before he gained complete mastery. Then he was able to level out and bore westward, the rising sun at his back, the sea of deadly green beneath him, and somewhere far ahead the faint promise of clean, radiation-free land holding the help they needed. Mile after mile of the green jungle swept under the flitter, and the flash of the counter's light continued to record a land unfit for mankind. Even with the equipment used on distant worlds to protect what spacemen had come to recognize as a reasonably tough human frame, no ground force could hope to explore that wilderness in person. And, flying above it, as well insulated as he was, Dane knew that he could be dangerously exposed. If the contaminated territory extended more than 1,000 miles, his danger was no longer problematical. It was an established fact. He had only the vague directions from the scrap of map Rip had uncovered. To the west, he had no idea how far away, there stretched a length of coastline, far enough from the radiation-blasted area to allow small settlements. For generations, the population of Terra, decimated by the atomic wars, and then drained by first system and then galactic exploration and colonization, had been decreasing. But within the past 100 years it was again on the upswing. Men retiring from space were returning to their native planet to live out their remaining years. The descendants of far-flung colonists, coming home on visits, found the sparsely populated mother world appealed to some basic instinct so that they remained. And now the settlements of mankind were on the march, spreading out from the well-established sections which had not been blighted by ancient wars. It was mid-afternoon when Dane noted that the green carpet beneath the flitter was displaying holes, that small breaks in the vegetation became sizable stretches of rocky waste. He kept one eye on the counter, and what, when he left the spacer, had been an almost steady beam of warning light was now a well-defined succession of blinks. The land below was cooling off. Perhaps he had passed the worst of the journey. But in that passing, how much had he and the flitter become contaminated? Ollie had devised a method of protection for the empty suit the medic would wear. Had that held? There were an alarming number of dark ifs in the immediate future. The mutant growths were now only thin patches of stunted and yellowish green. Had man penetrated only this far into the burn, the knowledge of what lay beyond would be totally false. This effect of dreary waste might well discourage exploration. Now the blink of the counter was deliberate, with whole seconds of pause between the flashes. Cooling off? It was getting cold fast. He wished that he had a comm unit. Because of the interference in the burn, he had left it behind, but with one he might be able now to locate some settlement. All that remained was to find the seashore, and, with it as a guide, flit south towards the center of modern civilization. He laid no plans of action. This whole exploit must depend on improvisation, and, as a free trader, spur-of-the-moment action was a necessary way of life. On the frontier rim of the galaxy, where the independent spacers traced the star trails, fast thinking and the ability to change plans on an instant were as important as skill in aiming a blaster. And it was very often proven that the tongue, and the brain behind it, were more deadly than a flamer. The sun was in Dane's face now, and he caught sight of patches of uncontaminated earth with honest vegetation, in place of the hot jungle now miles behind. That night he camped out on the edge of rough pasturage, where the counter no longer flashed its warning, and he was able to shed the suit and sleep under the stars with the fresh air of early summer against his cheek, and the smell of honest growing things replacing the dry scent of the spacer and the languorous perfumes of Sargol. He lay on his back, flat against the earth of which he was truly a part, staring up into the dark, inverted bowl of the heavens. It was so hard to connect those distant points of icy light making the well-remembered patterns overhead with the sun's whose rays had added to the brown stain on his skin. Sargol's sun, the one which gave such limited light to dead Limbo, the sun under which Naxos, his first galactic port, grew its food. He could not pick them out. He was not even sure that any could be sighted from Terra. Strange suns, red, orange, blue-green, white, yet here all looked alike, points of glitter. Tomorrow at dawn he must go on. He turned his head away from the sky, and grass, green Terran grass, was soft beneath his cheek. Yet, unless he was successful tomorrow or the next day, he might never have the right to feel that grass again. Resolutely, Dane willed that thought out of his mind, tried to fix upon something more lulling, which would bring with it the sleep he must have before he went on. And in the end he did sleep, deeply, dreamlessly, as if the touch of Terra's soil was in itself the sedative his tautly strung nerves needed. It was before sunrise that he awoke, stiff and chilled. The dryness of the pre-dawn gave partial light, and somewhere a bird was twittering. There had been birds, or things whose far-off ancestors had been birds, in the hot forest. Did they also sing to greet the dawn? Dane went over the flitter with his small counter, and was relieved to find that they had done a good job of shielding under Ollie's supervision. Once the suit he had worn was stored, he could sit at the controls without danger and in comfort. And it was good to be free of that metal prison. This time he took to the air with ease, the salt taste of food concentrate on his tongue as he sucked a cube. And his confidence arose with the flitter. This was the day. Somehow he knew it. He was going to find what he sought. It was less than 2 hours after sunrise that he did so. A village, which was a cluster of perhaps 50 or so house units strung along into the land. He skimmed across it and brought the flitter down in a rock cliff-walled sand pocket with surf booming some yards away, where he could be reasonably sure of safe hiding. All right, he had found a village. Now what? A medic. A stranger appearing on the lane which served the town, a stranger in a distinctive uniform of trade, would only incite conjecture and betrayal. He had to plan now. Dane unsealed his tunic. He should by rights shed his space boots too, but perhaps he could use those to color his story. He thrust the blaster into hiding at his waist. A rip or two in his undertunic, a shallow cut from his bush knife allowed to bleed messily. He could not see himself to judge the general effect, but had to hope it was the right one. His chance to test his acting powers came sooner than he had anticipated. Luckily, he had climbed out of the hidden cove before he was spotted by the boy, who came whistling along the path, a fishing pole over his shoulder, a basket swinging from his hand. Dane assumed an expression which he thought would suggest fatigue, pain, and bewilderment, and lurched forward, as if in sighting the oncoming boy he had also sighted hope. "Help!" Perhaps it was excitement which gave his utterance that convincing croak. Rod and basket fell to the ground as the boy, after one astounded stare, ran forward. "What's the matter?" His eyes were on those space boots, and he added a "sir" which had the ring of hero worship. "Escape boat." Dane waved toward the sea's general direction. "Medic! Must get to medic!" "Yes, sir." The boy's basic Terran sounded good. "Can you walk if I help you?" Dane managed a weak nod, but contrived that he did not lean too heavily on his avidly helpful guide. "The medic's my father, sir. We're right down this slope, 3rd house. And father hasn't left. He's supposed to go on a northern inspection tour today." Dane felt a stab of distaste for the role being forced upon him. When he had visualized the medic he must abduct to serve the Queen in her need, he had not expected to have to kidnap a family man. Only the knowledge that he did have the extra suit, and that he had made the outward trip without dangerous exposure, bolstered up his determination to see the plan through. When they came out at the end of a single long lane which tied the houses of the village together, Dane was puzzled to see the place so deserted. But since it was not within his role of dazed sufferer to ask questions, he did not do so. It was his young guide who volunteered the information he wanted. "Most everyone is out with the fleet. There's a run of redbacks." Dane understood. Within recent times the redbacks of the north had become a desirable luxury item for Terran tables. If a school of them were to be found in the vicinity, no wonder this village was now deserted as its fleet went out to garner in this elusive but highly succulent fish. "In here, sir." Dane found himself being led to a house on the right. "Are you in trade?" He suppressed a start. Shedding his uniform tunic had not done much in the way of disguise. It would be nice, he thought a little bitterly, if he could flash an IS badge now to completely confuse the issue. But he answered with the partial truth and did not enlarge. "Yes." The boy was flushed with excitement. "I'm trying for trade service medic," he confided. "Passed the directive exam last month, but I still have to go up for prelim psycho." Dane had a flash of memory. Not too many months before, not the prelim psycho, but the big machine at the assignment center had decided his own future arbitrarily, fitting him into the crew of the Solar Queen as the ship where his abilities, knowledge, and potentialities could best work to the good of the service. At the time he had resented, and even been slightly ashamed of being relegated to a free-trading spacer, while Archer Sands and other classmates from the pool had walked off with company assignments. Now he knew that he would not trade the smallest and most rusty bolt from the Solar Queen for the newest scout ship in IS or Combine Registry. And this boy from the frontier village might be himself as he was 5 years earlier. Though he had never known a real home or family, scrapping into the pool from one of the children's depots. "Good luck." He meant that, and the boy's flush deepened. "Thank you, sir. Around here. Father's treatment room has this other door." Dane allowed himself to be helped into the treatment room and sat down in a chair while the boy hurried off to locate the medic. The trader's hand went to the butt of his concealed blaster. It was a job he had to do, one he had volunteered for, and there was no backing out. But his mouth had a wry twist as he drew out the blaster and made ready to point it at the inner door. Or, his mind leaped to another idea, could he get the medic safely out of the village? A story about another man badly injured, perhaps pinned in the wreckage of an escape boat. He could try it. He thrust the blaster back inside his torn undertunic, hoping the bulge would pass unnoticed. "My son says—" Dane looked up. The man who came through the inner door was in early middle age, thin, wiry, with a hard, fine-down look about him. He could almost be Tao's elder brother. He crossed the room with a brisk stride, and came to stand over Dane, his hand reaching to pull aside the bloody cloth covering the trader's breast. But Dane fended off that examination. "My partner," he said, "back there, pinned in." He jerked his hand southward. "Needs help." The medic frowned. "Most of the men are out with the fleet. Georges," he spoke to the boy who had followed him, "go and get Lex and Hartog. Here." He tried to push Dane back into the chair as the trader got up. "Let me look at that cut." Dane shook his head. "No time now, sir. My partner's hurt bad. Can you come?" "Certainly." The medic reached for the emergency kit on the shelf behind him. "You able to make it?" "Yes." Dane was exultant. It was going to work. He could tow the medic away from the village. Once out among the rocks on the shoreline, he could pull the blaster and herd the man into the flitter. His luck was going to hold, after all. End of Chapter 14. Chapter 15. Medic Hovan reports. Fortunately, the path out of the straggling town was a twisted one, and in a very short space they were hidden from view. Dane paused, as if the pace was too much for an injured man. The medic put out a steadying hand, only to drop it quickly when he saw the weapon which had appeared in Dane's grip. "What?" His mouth snapped shut. His jaw tightened. "You will march ahead of me." Dane's low voice was steady. "Beyond that rock spur to the left, you'll find a place where it is possible to climb down to sea level. Do it." "I suppose I shouldn't ask why?" "Not now. We haven't much time. Get moving." The medic mastered his surprise, and without further protest obeyed orders. It was only when they were standing by the flitter and he saw the suits that his eyes widened, and he said, "The big burn." "Yes, and I'm desperate." "You must be, or mad." The medic stared at Dane for a long moment, and then shook his head. "What is it? A plague ship?" Dane bit his lip. The other was too astute. But he did not ask why or how he had been able to guess so shrewdly. Instead, he gestured to the suit Ollie had lashed beneath the seat in the flitter. "Get into that and be quick about it." The medic rubbed his hand across his jaw. "I think you might just be desperate enough to use that thing you're brandishing about so melodramatically if I don't," he remarked in a calm, conversational tone. "I won't kill, but a blaster burn." "Can be pretty painful. Yes, I know that, young man. And—" Suddenly he shrugged, put down his kit, and started donning the suit. "I wouldn't put it past you to knock me out and load me aboard if I did say no." "All right." Suited, he took his place on the seat as Dane directed. And then the traitor followed the additional precaution of lashing the medic's metal-encased arms to his body before he climbed into his own protective covering. Now they could only communicate by sight through the vision plates of their helmets. Dane triggered the controls, and they arose out of the sand and rock hollow just as a party of 2 men and a boy came hurrying along the top of the cliff, George and the rescuers arriving too late. The flitter spiraled up into the sunlight, and Dane wondered how long it would be before this outrage was reported to the nearest planet police base. But would any police cruiser have the hardihood to follow him into the Big Burn? He hoped that the radiation would hold them back. There was no navigation to be done. The flitter's memory should deposit them at the Queen. Dane wondered at what his silent companion was now thinking. The medic had accepted his kidnapping with such docility that the very ease of their departure began to bother Dane. Was the other expecting a trailer? Had exploration into the Big Burn from the seaside villages been more extensive than reported officially? He stepped up the power of the flitter to the top notch, and saw with some relief that the ground beneath them was now the rocky waste bordering the devastated area. The metal-encased figure that shared his seat had not moved, but now the bubble had turned, as if the medic were intent upon the ground flowing beneath them. The flicker of the counter began, and Dane realized that nightfall would find them still airborne. But so far he had not been aware of any pursuit. Again, he wished he had the use of a comm, only here the radiation would blanket sound with that continuous roar. Patches of the radiation vegetation showed now, and something in the lines of the medic's tense figure suggested that these were new to him. Afternoon waned as the patches united, spread into the beginning of the jungle as the counter was once more an almost steady light. When the evening closed in, they were not caught in darkness, for below trees, looping vines, brush had a pale, evil glow of their own, proclaiming their toxicity with bluish halos. Sometimes pockets of these made a core of light which pulsed, sending warning fingers at the flitter which sped across it. The hour was close on midnight before Dane sighted the other light, the pink-red of which winked through the ghastly blue-white, with a natural and comforting promise, even though it had been meant for an entirely different purpose. The Queen had Earth with her distress lights on, and no one had remembered to snap them off. Now they acted as a beacon to draw the flitter to its berth. Dane brought the stripped flyer down on the fused ground as close to the spot from which he had taken off as he could remember. Now, if those on the spacer would only move fast enough. But he need not have worried. His arrival had been anticipated. Above, the rounded side of the spacer bulged as the hatch opened. Lines swung down to fasten their magnetic clamps on the flitter. Then, once more, they were airborne, swinging up to be warped into the side of the ship. As the outer port of the flitter berth closed, Dane reached over and pulled loose the lashing which immobilized his companion. The medic stood up, a little awkwardly, as might any man who wore space armor the first time. The inner hatch was now opened, and Dane waved his captive into the small section which must serve them as a decontamination space. Free at last of the suits, they went through one more improvised hatch to the main corridor of the Queen, where Rip and Ollie stood waiting, their weary faces lighting as they saw the medic. It was the latter who spoke first. "This is a plague ship." Rip shook his head. "It is not, sir, and you're the one who's going to help us prove that." The man leaned back against the wall, his face expressionless. "You take a rather tough way of trying to get help." "It was the only way left us. I'll be frank," Rip continued. "We're patrol-posted." The medic's shrewd eyes went from one drawn young face to the next. "You don't look like desperate criminals," was his comment. "This your full crew?" "All the rest are your concern. That is, if you'll take the job." Rip's shoulders slumped a little. "You haven't left me much choice, have you? If there is illness on board, I'm under the oath, whether you are patrol-posted or not. What's the trouble?" They got him down to Tao's laboratory and told him their story. From a slight incredulity, his expression changed to an alert interest, and he demanded to see, first the patients, and then the pests now immured in a deep freeze. Sometime in the middle of this, Dane, overcome by fatigue, which was partly relief from tension, sought his cabin and the bunk from which he wearily disposed Sinbad, only to have the purring cat crawl back once more when he had lain down. And when he awoke, renewed in body and spirit, it was in a new Queen, a ship in which hope and confidence now ruled. "Hovan's already got it," Rip told him exultantly. "It's that poison from the little devil's claw, right enough. A narcotic. Produces some of the effects of deep sleep. In fact, it may have medical use. He's excited about it." "All right." Dane waved aside information which, under other circumstances, promising as it did a chance for future trade, would have engrossed him, to ask a question which at the moment seemed far more to the point. "Can he get our men back on their feet?" A little of Rip's exuberance faded. "Not right away. He's given them all shots, but he thinks they'll have to sleep it off." "And we have no idea how long that is going to take," Ollie contributed. Time, for the first time in days Dane was struck by that. Time. Because of his training, a fact he had forgotten in the past weeks of worry now came to mind: their contract with the Storm Priests. Even if they were able to clear themselves of the plague charge, even if the rest of the crew were speedily restored to health, he was sure that they could not hope to return to Sargol with the promised cargo, the pay for which was already on board the Queen. They would have broken their pledge, and there could be no hope of holding to their trading rights on that world, if they were not blacklisted for breaking contract into the bargain. IS would be able to move in and clean up, and probably they could never prove that the company was behind their misfortunes, though the men of the Queen would always be convinced that that fact was the truth. "We're going to break contract," he said aloud, and that shook the other two, knocked some of their assurance out of them. "How about that?" Rip asked Ollie. The acting engineer nodded. "We have fuel enough to lift from here and maybe set down at Terraport, if we take it careful and cut vectors. We can't lift from there without refueling. And of course, the patrol are going to sit on their hands while we do that, with us posted. No, put out of your heads any plan for getting back to Sargol within the time limit. Thorson's right. That way we're flamed out." Rip slumped in his seat. "So, the Izies can take over after all?" "As I see it," Dane cut in, "let's just take one thing at a time. We may have to argue a broken contract out before the board, but first we have to get off the posted hook with the patrol. Have you any idea about how we're going to handle that?" "Hovan's on our side. In fact, if we let him have the bugs to play with, he'll back us all the way. He can swear us a clean bill of health before the medic control center." "How much will that count after we've broken all their regs?" Ollie wanted to know. "If we surrender now, we're not going to have much chance, no matter what Hovan does or does not swear to. Hovan's a frontier medic. I won't say that he's not a member in good standing of their association, but he doesn't have top star rating, and with the Izies and the patrol on our necks, we'll need more than one medic's word." But Rip looked from the pessimistic Camille to Dane. Now he asked a question which was more than half statement. "You've thought of something." "I've remembered something," the cargo apprentice corrected. "Recall the trick Van pulled on Limbo, when the patrol was trying to ease us out of our rights there after they took over the outlaw hold?" Ollie was impatient. "He threatened to talk to the video people and broadcast. Tell everybody about the ships wrecked by the Forerunner installation and left lying about full of treasure. But what has that to do with us now? We bargained away our rights on Limbo for the rest of Cam's monopoly on Sargol. Not that it's done us much good." "The video," Dane fastened on the important point. "Van threatened publicity which would embarrass the patrol, and he was legally within his rights. We're outside the law now, but publicity might help again. How many Earthside people know of the unwritten law about open war on plague ships? How many who aren't spacemen know that we could be legally pushed into the sun and fried, without any chance to prove we're innocent of carrying a new disease? If we could talk loud and clear to the people at large, maybe we'd have a chance for a real hearing." "Right from the Terraport broadcast station, I suppose," Ollie taunted. "Why not?" There was silence in the cabin as the other two chewed upon that, and he broke it again. "We set down here when it had never been done before." With one brown forefinger, Rip traced some pattern known only to himself on the top of the table. Ollie stared at the opposite wall as if it were a bank of machinery he must master. "It just might be whirly enough to work," Camille commented softly. "Or maybe we've been spaced too long, and the whisperers have been chattering into our ears. What about it, Rip? Could you set us down close enough to center block there?" "We can try anything once, but we might crash the old girl bringing her in. There's that apron between the company's launching cradles and the center. It's clear there, and we could give an E-signal coming down which would make them stay rid of it. But I won't try it except as a last resort." Dane noticed that after that discouraging statement, Rip made straight for Jellicoe's record tapes and routed out the one which dealt with Terraport and the landing instructions for that metropolis of the starships. To land unbidden there would certainly bring them publicity, and to get the video broadcast and tell their story would grant them not only worldwide but system-wide hearing. News from Terraport was broadcast on every channel every hour of the day and night, and not a single viewer could miss their appeal. But first there was Hovan to be consulted. Would he be willing to back them with his professional knowledge and assurance? Or would their high-handed method of recruiting his services operate against them now? They decided to let Rip ask such questions of the medic. "So, you're going to set us down in the center of the big jump-off," was his first comment, as the acting captain of the Queen stated their case. "Then you want me to fire my rockets to certify you are harmless. You don't ask for very much, do you, son?" Rip spread his hands. "I can understand how it looks to you, sir. We grabbed you, we brought you here by force. We can't make you testify for us if you decide not to." "Can't you?" The medic cocked an eyebrow at him. "What about this bully boy of yours with his little blaster? He could herd me right up to the telecast, couldn't he? There's a lot of persuasion in one of those nasty little arms. On the other hand, I have a son who's set on taking out on one of these tin pots to go star hunting. If I handed you over to the patrol, he might make some remarks to me in private. You may be posted, but you don't look like very hardened criminals to me. It seems that you've been handed a bad situation and handled it as best you know. And I'm willing to ride along the rest of the way on your tail blast. Let me see how many pieces you land us in at Terraport, and I'll give you my final answer. If luck holds, we may have a couple more of your crew present by that time also." They had had no indication that the Queen had been located, that any posse hunting the kidnapped medic had followed them into the Big Burn, and they could only hope that they would continue to remain unsighted as they upped ship once more and cruised into a regular traffic lane for earthing at the port. It would be a chancy thing, and Ollie and Rip spent hours checking the mechanics of that flight, while Dane and the recovering Weeks worked with Hovan in an effort to restore the sleeping crew. After 3 visits to the hold, and the discovery that the Hubbat had uncovered no more of the pests, Dane caged the angry blue horror and returned it to its usual stand in Jellicoe's cabin, certain that the ship was clean, for Sinbad now confidently prowled the corridors and went into every cabin of storage space Dane opened for him. And on the morning of the day they had planned for takeoff, Hovan at last had a definite response to his treatment. Craig Tau roused, stared dazedly around, and asked a vague question. The fact that he immediately relapsed once more into semi-coma did not discourage the other medic. Progress had been made, and he was now sure that he knew the proper treatment. They strapped down at 0 hour and blasted out of the weird green wilderness they had not dared to explore, lifting into the arch of the sky, depending upon Rip's knowledge to put them safely down again. Dane once more rode out the takeoff at the comm unit, waiting for the blast of radiation-borne static to fade so that he could catch any broadcast. "Turned back last night. The high level of radiation makes it almost certain that the outlaws could not have headed into the dangerous central portion. Search is now spreading north. Authorities are inclined to believe that this last outrage may be a clue to the vanished Solar Queen, a plague ship warned off and patrol posted after her crew plundered an Estat belonging to the Intersolar Corporation. Anyone having any information concerning this ship, or any strange spacer, report at once to the nearest Terra Police or patrol station. Do not take chances. Report any contact at once to the nearest Terra Police or patrol station." "That's putting it strongly," Dane commented as he relayed the message. "Good as giving orders for us to be flamed down at sight." "Well, if we set down in the right spot," Rip replied, "they can't flame us out without blasting the larger part of Terraport Field with us, and I don't think they're going to do that in a hurry." Dane hoped Shannon was correct in that belief. It would be more chancy than landing at the Estat or in the Big Burn. To gauge it just right and put them down on the Terraport apron where they could not be flamed out without destroying too much, where their very position would give them a bargaining point, was going to be a top-star job, If Rip could only pull it off. He could not evaluate the niceties of that flight. He did not understand all Rip was doing. But he did know enough to remain quietly in his place, ask no questions, and await results with a dry mouth and a wildly beating heart. There came a moment when Rip glanced at him, one hand poised over the control board. The pilot's voice came tersely, thin and queer. "Pray it out, Dane. Here we go." Dane heard the shrill of a riding beam, so tearing he had to move his earphones. They must be almost on top of the control tower to get it like that. Rip was planning a set-down where the Queen would block things neatly. He brought his own fingers down on the EE red button to give the last and most powerful warning. That, to be used only when a ship landing was out of control, should clear the ground below. They could only pray it would vacate the port they were still far from seeing. "Make it a fin point, Rip." He couldn't repress that one bit of advice. And he was glad he had given it when he saw a ghost grin tug for a moment at Rip's full lips. "Good enough for a check ride?" They were riding her flaming jets down as they would on a strange world. Below, the port must be wild. Dane counted off the seconds. 2, 3, 4, 5. Just a few more and they would be too low to intercept, without endangering innocent coasters and ground-huggers. When the last minute during which they were still vulnerable passed, he gave a sigh of relief. That was one more point on their side. In the earphones was a crackle of frantic questions, a gabble of orders screaming at him. Let them rave. They'd know soon enough what it was all about. End of Chapter 15.